In the lowlands of Mississippi, in the year 1842, there lived a man who called himself a healer but practiced cruelty in the guise of medicine. Dr. Thaddeus Grayson, a man of supposed intellect and refined manners, treated his plantation slaves as little more than specimens for his twisted experiments. Every cough, every fever, every minor injury became a reason for his clinical curiosity. His clinic, a small wooden structure near the main house, smelled of tinctures, herbs, and the faint metallic tang of blood. Patients were rarely asked for consent, and the line between medicine and torment blurred in the eyes of those he treated. Whispers among the enslaved spoke of mysterious pills, strange injections, and sleepless nights filled with fear. No one dared to challenge the doctor except one. Among the slaves, a young man named Samuel had watched Dr. Grayson with both fear and cunning. Samuel was quiet, observant, and seemingly compliant, but beneath his calm exterior burned a mind sharp as steel. He had witnessed the doctor's cruelty firsthand, his mother writhing under experimental treatments, his sister forced to endure hours of painful injections, his friends sent home weaker than when they had arrived. Each act left a mark, not just on the bodies, but on the spirits of those who endured them. The time would come when Samuel's patience and courage would collide with Grayson's hubris, and when it did, the plantation would never be the same again. Samuel had learned early that survival meant observation. From the moment he had been sold to Dr. Grayson's plantation, he had noted the doctor's routines, the subtle shifts in his mood, the meticulous way he recorded every detail in his leather-bound journals. Samuel watched silently as the doctor administered his so-called cures, noting which slaves grew weaker, which ones cried in pain, and which ones began to vanish from the quarters entirely. Grayson's fascination with disease and the human body was unending, but so too was his arrogance. He believed no one on the plantation possessed the wit to outsmart him, and his overconfidence blinded him to Samuel's quiet defiance. "Take another dose of this," Grayson would say, holding a small vial of thick amber liquid. The slaves obeyed, trembling, knowing that refusal would invite punishment far worse than the medicine itself. Samuel studied the vials. He had memorized the labels, the ingredients, and even the subtle changes in color that occurred when the doctor mixed his concoctions. To the others, Samuel appeared meek, almost broken, but inside, he was crafting a plan. The doctor's arrogance was his weakness, and Samuel intended to exploit it. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a red glow across the fields, Samuel lingered in the doctor's study under the pretense of fetching herbs. Grayson, engrossed in his notes, barely noticed him. The young man's fingers brushed over the array of bottles, inhaling their sharp chemical scents, examining their contents with the precision of a scholar. He found the vial that would become the instrument of justice, a mixture meant to induce delirium and weakness, administered to a sickly woman in the plantation quarters. Samuel had spent nights observing the doctor's routines, understanding the methods he used to track dosages, to note symptoms, and to dismiss complaints. That knowledge became his weapon. He began to swap the contents of the vials, carefully, meticulously, ensuring that the doctor himself would be the first to ingest the altered medicine. A small drop here, a pinch of a harmless but potent counteragent there, everything was timed for maximum effect. Grayson never suspected a thing. Each evening, he continued his rounds, praising himself for his supposed skill, unaware that Samuel's quiet eyes followed his every move. When the doctor administered the potion to himself as part of his nightly self-experimentation, he did so without fear. But tonight, the ritual would backfire. As Grayson raised the vial to his lips, Samuel's heart pounded, not with fear, but with the electric thrill of justice finally taking shape. Within moments, the doctor's confident expression began to falter. His hands shook, his vision blurred, and the journal he clutched slipped from his grasp. For the first time, the mighty Dr. Thaddeus Grayson felt the disorientation, weakness, and vulnerability he had inflicted on countless others. In the shadows, Samuel watched. This was only the beginning. One man's hubris had given him the opening he needed, and soon, the plantation would know that the cleverness of the oppressed could rival and even surpass the arrogance of the oppressor. By the end of that night, the lines of power would shift. Samuel would no longer be merely a patient. He would become the arbiter of the doctor's fate, the quiet architect of vengeance, and the symbol of justice for those who had long suffered under Grayson's hands. The night settled over the plantation, heavy with suspense and the promise of reckoning. And in the doctor's study, once a place of fear, the first tremors of a revolution quietly began. The following morning, the plantation stirred under the unrelenting heat of a Mississippi sun. Birds chirped, horses whinnied, and the usual sounds of labor echoed across the fields. Yet within the confines of the Grayson estate, something was different. Dr. Thaddeus Grayson, once a figure of unchallenged authority, moved with an unfamiliar stiffness. His limbs ached, his stomach churned, and a haze clouded his usually sharp mind. He blamed it on fatigue, on the oppressive heat, or perhaps on some minor ailment he could cure with a stronger tincture. What he did not realize was that the sickness was no natural malady. It was Samuel's careful design, a mirror of the pain he had so long inflicted on others. Samuel observed from the shadows as Grayson staggered into his study. The doctor's notes lay open, the ink smeared where his trembling hands had knocked over a bottle. Each step he took was unsteady. Each attempt to write another prescription met with failure. He mumbled to himself, the words slurred, the air of confidence shattered. Samuel's lips curved into a barely perceptible smile. Justice, patient and deliberate, was beginning to unfurl. But Samuel knew patience was key. He could not act too soon. Grayson's arrogance might have been broken, but he was still dangerous, still capable of violence. The young slave had learned long ago that survival demanded cunning, and now his intellect would be his weapon. Carefully, he moved among the other slaves, quietly instructing them to maintain their routines, to watch without interfering, to appear unconcerned. To them, Samuel's calm demeanor belied the storm of planning raging within him. The day wore on. Grayson attempted his usual rounds among the slaves, checking pulses, examining sores, and administering his now tainted remedies. Each act of cruelty, once performed without hesitation, was now laborious and awkward. He dropped tools, mismeasured doses, and scolded his patients with a voice that trembled with frustration. None of the enslaved dared laugh. Yet whispers of his uncharacteristic weakness rippled through the quarters. Even the most loyal among them could not help but notice that the mighty doctor, feared and reviled, now faltered under the weight of his own hubris. In the evening, Samuel made his move. The doctor, exhausted and disoriented, returned to his private study to record the day's notes. Samuel entered quietly, carrying a small vial he had prepared over weeks, a mixture designed to amplify the doctor's delirium and render him immobile without causing immediate death. The moment was delicate. If the dosage was too strong, it could kill him too quickly. If too weak, the plan might fail. Samuel had calibrated every drop with precision, knowing the stakes were life and death, not only for himself but for everyone on the plantation. "Good evening, doctor," Samuel said softly, presenting the vial under the guise of obedience. Grayson looked up, squinting through the haze clouding his mind. His pride, however diminished, still demanded that he accept Samuel's offering. Yes. Prepare this for me," he muttered, his words sluggish. Samuel poured the contents into Grayson's remaining medicinal mixture and stepped back, his heart steady despite the tension. Moments passed in silence. Grayson took the dose, believing it to be one of his standard concoctions. Almost immediately, his expression shifted from confusion to panic. His pulse raced, sweat beaded on his forehead, and a tremor coursed through his limbs. He gripped the edge of the desk, trying to summon the strength to stand, but each movement left him weaker, more dependent, more human in his vulnerability than he had ever been. Samuel observed the doctor's struggle with careful attention. Every stumble, every faltering step, reinforced the truth he had long held in his heart. Knowledge, cunning, and patience were more powerful than brute force. Grayson's arrogance, his relentless cruelty, had been his undoing. By nightfall, Grayson could no longer leave his study. Samuel had ensured the doctor's isolation while maintaining the facade of routine. Outside, the plantation appeared unchanged. Fields still stretched toward the horizon, chores continued, and the enslaved moved as they always had. But within the walls of the doctor's study, a quiet revolution had begun. Samuel sat by the doorway, his eyes unwavering. The other slaves peeked from behind corners and doorways, their expressions a mixture of awe and cautious hope. They had long suffered under Grayson's experiments, but now they sensed that their tormentor could be undone. Samuel did not speak of vengeance, not yet. Words were unnecessary. Actions would speak louder than any declaration. Tonight, the doctor would taste fear, helplessness, and disorientation, the very sensations he had inflicted so freely. And tomorrow, Samuel would escalate his plan. The carefully constructed network of observation, patience, and cunning would continue to tighten around Grayson. The plantation had been a place of suffering for decades, but Samuel's quiet ingenuity was reshaping it. The slaves were no longer merely victims. They were witnesses to the unraveling of tyranny. And in the shadows of the study, Samuel allowed himself a small, satisfied thought. The healer who had harmed so many would soon learn what it meant to be powerless, watched, and outsmarted by those he had always underestimated. The night deepened, and the air hung heavy with anticipation. Justice, slow and deliberate, moved silently through the plantation corridors, heralding the reckoning that would not be denied. The sun rose over the Grayson plantation like a dull, burning eye, illuminating the fields where labor continued under the relentless heat. Yet, inside the main house, a storm brewed invisible to all but the keenest observer. Dr. Thaddeus Grayson, once the unquestioned master of science and flesh, was now a shadow of himself, trembling, disoriented, and increasingly dependent on the very hands he had spent years subjugating. Samuel had watched the night pass with meticulous attention. Every time the doctor tried to move, every time he fumbled with his instruments, Samuel recorded it in his mind like a scholar, noting experiments in a journal. He knew that brute force was unnecessary. This was a war of patience and intellect. Grayson's body and pride were vulnerable, and Samuel intended to exploit every weakness with precision. By mid-morning, the doctor attempted his usual rounds of experimentation, but his weakness betrayed him. He dropped vials, spilled tinctures, and miscalculated dosages. The screams of pain and frustration he had once elicited from slaves now echoed back into his own ears, reflected in a grotesque mirror of helplessness. Samuel observed silently, guiding the other slaves in subtle ways, moving trays just so, ensuring the doctor's workspace became a labyrinth of confusion, amplifying his disorientation without a single word. The other enslaved watched with cautious fascination. For years, they had endured the doctor's cruel experiments, forced inoculations, invasive procedures, and the theft of their bodies for his scientific curiosity. Now, the same tools of torment were beginning to ensnare their tormentor. Fear, once a weapon wielded solely by Grayson, began to inhabit his eyes, and the power dynamic that had ruled the plantation for decades started to shift. Samuel's plan, however, went beyond mere sabotage. He had spent months observing the doctor's habits, his reliance on precise chemical mixtures, and his arrogance in underestimating those he considered inferior. Samuel began altering the compound subtly, not enough to kill, yet enough to induce vivid hallucinations and physical weakness. Each dose was carefully calculated, designed to make Grayson doubt his own senses, to make the very instruments of his experiments seem alien and dangerous. By afternoon, the doctor's mind wavered. He muttered incoherently, spilling a tincture on his own hands and recoiling in alarm as though it were poison. Samuel entered the room, ostensibly to assist, but each step he took was calculated to further unsettle the doctor. A jar tipped here, a mislaid scalpel there, all minor, all deliberate. Each act compounded the doctor's panic. Each glance from Samuel a silent reminder that he was being watched, studied, and outmaneuvered. Grayson's arrogance, which had been a source of terror for the enslaved, now became his undoing. He shouted, he flailed, he demanded assistance from Samuel. Yet the young slave remained calm, serene, untouchable in his apparent obedience. It was a performance, and the doctor fell for it completely. The very hands that had once labored to maintain the doctor's machinery of pain now orchestrated his unraveling with quiet precision. As night approached, Samuel's strategy escalated. He prepared a small apparatus, using the doctor's own equipment, designed to simulate a catastrophic chemical reaction. Nothing lethal, yet terrifyingly real. He knew that the perception of danger often outweighed actual harm. Grayson, already weakened and frightened, would see a storm where none truly existed. Samuel placed the components carefully, ensuring that a single misstep would trigger a controlled cascade of sparks and smoke. When the apparatus finally went off, Grayson's screams filled the study. He staggered backward, tripping over scattered instruments, fumbling in his own panic. Samuel, calm and composed, guided him toward a chair and held his gaze, silent and unyielding. The doctor's mind spun, haunted by the illusion of imminent death, unable to distinguish reality from the hallucinatory effects of the subtly poisoned tinctures. The other slaves, hidden behind doorways and curtains, whispered in astonishment. Samuel's brilliance lay not in brute retaliation, but in the surgical application of intellect and strategy. Every act, every chemical alteration, every carefully orchestrated scare had been designed to teach the doctor the terror of helplessness, the same terror he had inflicted on others. By the end of the evening, Grayson was a broken figure, shivering and wide-eyed, forced to confront the fragility of his own body and mind. Samuel remained the calm eye of the storm, a figure of quiet power and unassailable control. He had not yet struck a fatal blow. He did not need to. The lessons were being learned, and the plantation itself seemed to acknowledge the shifting tides of power. Samuel's mind, ever alert, planned the next stage. Grayson would not escape his own undoing, for the young slave had discovered the formula for justice, and it was one that required no weapon heavier than intellect and patience. Tonight, the doctor would sleep in fear. Tomorrow, Samuel would escalate his carefully calculated terror. The plantation, outwardly serene under the moon's pale glow, now hid the tremors of a quiet revolution. Samuel had transformed his suffering into strategy, his oppression into opportunity. And in the shadows of the study, with Grayson trembling before him, he realized something profound. The oppressed, when cunning and patient, could bend even the most tyrannical of masters to their will. The following morning, a tense quiet settled over the Grayson plantation. The birds sang as if oblivious, but within the walls of the main house, a storm had already begun to brew. Dr. Thaddeus Grayson, once the architect of torment, now moved with hesitance, his hands trembling as he approached the laboratory. The smell of chemicals, once familiar and comforting in its control, now seemed to warn of invisible dangers lurking in every corner. Samuel had spent the night planning the next stage. Each detail mattered. The placement of instruments, the composition of tinctures, the timing of minor explosions designed to unsettle the doctor's senses. But Samuel also knew this was more than strategy. It was about teaching Grayson that knowledge alone could not grant invincibility. The mind that had once mocked and belittled him would now taste the chaos it had inflicted on others. Grayson began with the same routine, setting up glass vials and carefully measuring compounds. Yet the slightest distraction threw him into panic. A drop spilled, a scale tipped. The air smelled faintly of sulfur, and the doctor recoiled, hands shaking as he tried to correct the errors. Each mistake, Samuel had ensured, was amplified, the consequences appearing far more dangerous than they truly were. It was psychological warfare, and Grayson, for all his intellect, could not comprehend the invisible strings manipulating him. Samuel watched from the corner, his posture calm, his expression unreadable. He intervened subtly, nudging a vial, adjusting a flask's small axe that seemed helpful, but in reality increased the doctor's disorientation. Grayson's mutterings grew frantic. He questioned his calculations, cursed the instruments, and finally demanded Samuel explain what had gone wrong. The young slave merely looked on, calm and patient, waiting for the exact moment when fear would shatter the doctor's facade. The morning dragged on, and Samuel escalated the terror. He had prepared a series of chemical mixtures that would react in unpredictable ways when exposed to heat or light, creating smoke, sparks, and sudden eruptions. It was nothing that could cause lasting harm, but to Grayson, each flare of light, each hiss of smoke, felt like impending doom. The man's hands shook, and beads of sweat formed on his brow as he attempted to maintain control. Samuel remained still, his presence a silent reminder that the power balance had shifted. By midday, Grayson's exhaustion was apparent. His mind, so used to manipulating others, now scrambled to interpret reality. Every shadow seemed a threat, every sound an omen. Samuel introduced minor hallucinations through subtly altered compounds, odorless, tasteless chemicals that induced nausea, disorientation, and fleeting visions. Grayson staggered, dropping instruments, fumbling with his notes, and staring at walls as if they contained hidden enemies. Samuel's patience was remarkable. He did not rush. He did not gloat. Instead, he became the unseen conductor of the doctor's unraveling. Each misstep, each small panic, was carefully orchestrated to teach a lesson in humility and fear. Grayson's arrogance, which had once been a weapon, now became his vulnerability. The very tools of science he wielded with confidence had turned against him, guided by the hand of the one he had oppressed. The other slaves, watching from hidden vantage points, whispered quietly among themselves. Samuel's actions were precise, controlled, and yet utterly devastating. It was not brute force, but intellect, cunning, and timing that dominated the scene. Grayson, for the first time, understood the fragility of human mastery. He was powerless in a way he had never imagined, and the realization gnawed at his pride. As afternoon turned to evening, Samuel prepared the final act for the day. A complex setup of vials, tubes, and mirrors created an effect that simulated a violent chemical chain reaction. Sparks flew, smoke filled the room, and alarms that Samuel had rigged blared in concert with minor explosions. Grayson stumbled back, choking on smoke, panic-stricken and terrified. Samuel stepped forward calmly, guiding him to a chair, his eyes cold and unwavering. "You see, Master," Samuel said softly, "control is never permanent. Knowledge does not make you invincible, and the hand that seems powerless can always find a way." Grayson, trembling, could do nothing but nod, his mind spinning with fear and disbelief. The room, once a sanctuary of his intellect and pride, had become a theater of terror, and he the unwilling actor. Samuel had reversed the roles entirely. The master reduced to a victim, the slave elevated to a strategist and guardian of justice. By nightfall, the laboratory was still and silent, save for the occasional crackle of cooling chemicals. Grayson slumped in a chair, physically drained and mentally battered. Samuel, standing tall, surveyed his work. Today had proven a truth older than slavery itself. The oppressed, when clever and patient, could bend even the most tyrannical of masters to their will without lifting a sword. And tomorrow, the lessons would continue, escalating further, until Grayson truly understood the weight of fear and humility. The plantation, outwardly unchanged, now harbored an invisible revolution. Samuel had begun turning the doctor's own science against him, proving that intelligence, strategy, and courage could overcome years of cruelty and oppression. The balance of power had shifted, and there would be no return to the old order. The sun had barely risen when Samuel returned to the laboratory, moving silently through the early morning mist. The plantation still slumbered under a deceptive calm, but within the walls of the house, the air already trembled with tension. Today, Samuel intended to push Dr. Thaddeus Grayson further than ever before, beyond confusion, beyond panic into the realm where fear stripped a man of all pretense. Grayson entered the lab cautiously, each step hesitant, eyes darting nervously. His previous experiences had taught him that the smallest miscalculation could lead to disaster. Yet, he could not anticipate the precision with which Samuel now controlled every element of his environment. The vials, the instruments, the faint smell of chemicals in the air, all were arranged to simulate a world gone mad, a place where reality itself was unreliable. Samuel began with subtle manipulations. Small adjustments to the placement of the glass apparatus, minuscule changes in liquid composition that caused minor but alarming reactions. Each fizz, pop, or sudden smoke trail appeared accidental, yet was carefully calculated. Grayson flinched repeatedly, muttering curses under his breath, as if he could bargain with the chaos itself. The slave moved methodically, a silent observer at first, then gradually revealing his hand. Samuel introduced faint, imperceptible vibrations through the wooden floor, producing soft thuds that echoed through the laboratory like phantom footsteps. Mirrors were angled to create fleeting illusions of shadows that darted in the corner of Grayson's vision. Every sensory input was distorted, yet nothing was truly dangerous, nothing but fear itself. Hours passed, and Grayson's composure deteriorated. His calculations, once precise and confident, became erratic scribbles on yellowed paper. Each small chemical reaction he attempted seemed to betray him. A vial hissed unexpectedly, a colored solution turned black in moments, a thermometer rattled violently as if mocking his knowledge. Samuel remained calm, the eye of the storm, guiding and amplifying the doctor's terror without a word. By midday, Grayson's exhaustion was evident. His hands shook, his skin glistened with sweat, and his breathing had grown shallow. Samuel escalated the psychological pressure. He arranged a set of complex apparatus designed to simulate rapid, uncontrolled reactions, fumes, sparks, flashes of light, all choreographed to overwhelm the senses. Grayson backed into a corner, eyes wide, as the lab transformed into a theater of his worst nightmares. "Master," Samuel said quietly, stepping closer, "do you understand now? Knowledge does not protect you. Power does not shield you. The hand you once crushed can guide you to the edge of reason itself." Grayson could only nod, voice caught in his throat. His pride, so long a shield, had been eroded by relentless precision. The panic that coursed through him was now accompanied by a gnawing recognition. He had underestimated the intelligence and patience of the one he oppressed. Samuel's strategies were not brute force, they were far more terrifying, subtle and meticulous. In a final act of orchestrated chaos, Samuel set a series of chemical flares in motion. They erupted in sequence, small explosions that sent sparks dancing across the walls, minor fires that fizzled before causing harm, smoke that filled the room in ghostly waves. Grayson stumbled, coughing and choking, as he struggled to regain control. Every tool he had trusted for so long now appeared to betray him. Amid the smoke and confusion, Samuel moved with deliberate calm. He guided Grayson to a chair, placing a hand firmly on his shoulder. The contrast between the slave's composure and the doctor's terror was striking. Samuel's gaze was unwavering, his voice steady. "You see, the mind that once ruled by cruelty can itself be ruled by cunning and patience. Fear is not weakness, Master. It is clarity. And today, you are learning it firsthand." The rest of the day passed in silence, broken only by Grayson's labored breaths and occasional tremors. He sat slumped, a man stripped of authority, haunted by his own hubris. Samuel, standing at the center of the room, reflected on the lesson he had imparted, that intelligence and strategy could topple even the most entrenched power. Physical strength could oppress, but cunning and resolve could liberate. Outside, the plantation appeared unchanged. Fields swayed in the gentle breeze, and the labor of slaves continued as usual. Yet within the walls of the house, the balance of power had irrevocably shifted. Samuel had not only survived the doctor's cruelty, he had turned it back upon its source, demonstrating that intellect, patience, and courage were formidable weapons. By nightfall, Grayson was a shadow of the man he had been. The laboratory, once a domain of mastery, now bore witness to his humiliation. Samuel had orchestrated every detail, from the smoke and sparks to the subtle manipulations that had dismantled Grayson's mind. Tomorrow, he would continue the lessons, but for today, the doctor's fear was complete. Samuel left the lab quietly, returning to the quarters where the other slaves gathered. There were nods of acknowledgement and quiet murmurs of admiration. He had demonstrated that even the most formidable oppressor could be undone by intelligence and patience. In the shadows of the plantation, A silent revolution was taking shape, a revolution not of fire or weapons, but of strategy, courage, and the unyielding will to reclaim what had been stolen. The night fell over the plantation like a velvet shroud, thick and suffocating, but inside the house, the air vibrated with tension. Samuel moved quietly through the corridors, every step measured, every sound intentional. He had prepared for this night for months, orchestrating every detail with the precision of a general planning a siege. Tonight would mark the culmination of his silent war, a reckoning that no amount of wealth, pride, or cruelty could avert. Dr. Thaddeus Grayson sat alone in the study, the flickering light of a single oil lamp casting grotesque shadows across the walls. His hands, once steady instruments of control, now trembled uncontrollably. His mind, frayed by Samuel's relentless psychological assaults, teetered on the edge of madness. He knew Samuel was capable of brilliance, but the scope of the slave's cunning had begun to dawn on him in a way that made every instinct scream in terror. Samuel entered the room without a sound, his presence both commanding and unnerving. Grayson's eyes widened, a mixture of recognition and dread flooding his features. The doctor tried to rise, to assert some shred of authority, but Samuel's gaze held him firmly in place. "You've underestimated me for too long," Samuel said softly, his voice steady, unyielding. "You thought cruelty was your shield, your mind, your fortress. But tonight, every illusion is gone." From the shadows, Samuel produced a small satchel of meticulously prepared items, documents, notes, and records of Grayson's experiments. Every detail of the doctor's atrocities had been catalogued, every act of manipulation and abuse chronicled with care. Samuel spread the papers across the desk, each one a testament to the suffering Grayson had inflicted, and each one a weapon in the hands of the enslaved. Grayson's breathing quickened as he scanned the documents. Panic, fear, and disbelief collided on his face. You can't, these are nothing without proof," he stammered, voice quivering. "No one will believe." "They will," Samuel interrupted. "And tonight, they will see. The plantation, the town, the law, they will all see the truth. The hand that trembled with cruelty now trembles with realization. You have been exposed, Master. Your power is gone." With deliberate movements, Samuel opened a window to the night air. The sounds of the sleeping plantation, the distant lowing of cattle, the whisper of wind through the trees were deceptively calm. Yet in every corner of the estate, the story had begun to ripple outward. Samuel had shared fragments of evidence with trusted allies among the other slaves, ensuring that the truth could no longer be contained. Grayson's eyes darted frantically. You can't do this. I own this land. I own everything. You." Samuel stepped closer, his shadow merging with the flickering light to form an imposing silhouette. "Ownership is an illusion, Doctor. Control is an illusion. You taught me that with pain and fear, but now you will learn that knowledge, patience, and resolve can destroy those illusions. Tonight, you face the consequences of your actions, not with fire or steel, but with the weight of truth." A quiet knock echoed from the hall. Samuel gestured, and a group of trusted allies entered, holding copies of the records and quietly murmuring acknowledgments. Grayson's face drained of color. He had no army, no secret allies, no way to manipulate the situation in his favor. For the first time, he understood the full extent of his vulnerability. "Everything you did," Samuel continued, voice calm yet sharp, "is documented. The experiments, the lies, the betrayals, you can no longer hide behind arrogance. Every act of cruelty is now exposed, and justice will follow, whether this plantation burns or the law intervenes." Grayson sank into his chair, the weight of helplessness pressing down like a physical force. He had spent his life wielding fear as a weapon, believing it would ensure obedience and loyalty. Now, the very fear he inspired had turned inward, consuming him from within. Samuel, once the oppressed, now held complete dominion not through force, but through intellect, strategy, and unflinching courage. Outside, a subtle shift occurred. The other slaves, who had long endured in silence, now whispered among themselves, emboldened by Samuel's actions. They had witnessed a paradigm shift. The unbreakable could be broken, the oppressor could be subdued, and the powerless could reclaim agency. Grayson's final moments of resistance dissolved into quiet acceptance. The fire of his arrogance extinguished, leaving only a hollow shell of a man who had underestimated the depth of human ingenuity and will. Samuel stepped back, surveying the room, the papers, the man he had undone. Victory was not marked by violence, but by the undeniable proof that knowledge, patience, and determination could overturn even the most entrenched cruelty. As Samuel left the study, closing the door softly behind him, he knew the balance of the plantation had irrevocably shifted. The night air felt different, charged with the unspoken promise of change. No longer would the house echo with unchecked terror. No longer would cruelty reign unchallenged. Samuel had claimed more than revenge, he had claimed justice. Subtle, precise, and absolute. In the darkness, the plantation itself seemed to exhale, as if relieved to witness the fall of a tyrant. And amidst the shadows, Samuel moved with quiet confidence, the architect of a reckoning that would echo through generations. The doctor would never forget this night, and neither would anyone who witnessed the meticulous unraveling of his power. Samuel had proven, definitively, that intellect and courage were the mightiest forces of all.